Out here we entertain ourselves at home. So we got an Atari video game. There's so many different games to play. We especially like Space Invaders. Zapping those little devils from outer space. It's fun. But personally, I think the whole idea of creatures from outer space is a little far-fetched.
No other company offers you as many different video game cartridges as Atari.
Imagine this. It is summer 1982. It is a particularly hot day. You're wandering around the streets seeking relief from the heat when you come across the arcade. The manager is just opening up for the day. As you walk through the door, the arcade machines suddenly spring to life. The familiar noise of several arcade games you have personally played are springing to life. You approach the counter, you get a cup of soda and a cup of quarters. Walking around, you're taking your time as you are making your first important decision of the day: which game will you play first? As you pass yet another row of arcade machines, on the end you see a familiar friend. One that has been there practically from the beginning. And though there may be better games to play by now, you decide to start your gaming experience with a game where it all began for you. That game is Space Invaders.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Player One Start. Today I'm going to talk about Space Invaders. This is an iconic and landmark game that was not only the first of its kind, but influenced an entire generation of games after it, the impact of which is still being felt to this very day. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the history and see what this game is all about.
Space Invaders was created by Japanese designer Tomohiro Nishikado, who spent a year designing the game and developing the necessary hardware to produce it. The game's inspiration is reported to have come from varying sources, including an adaptation of a mechanical game, Space Monsters, which was released by Taito in 1972. Another story is a dream about Japanese schoolchildren who are waiting for Santa Claus when they are suddenly attacked by invading aliens. Nishikado himself has cited Atari's arcade game Breakout as his inspiration. He aimed to create a shooting game that featured the same sense of achievement from completing stages and destroying targets, but with more complex graphics. The game uses a similar layout to that of Breakout, but it has altered game mechanics. Rather than bouncing a ball back to attack static objects, players are given the ability to fire projectiles at moving enemies. Early enemy designs for the game included tanks, combat planes, and battleships. Nishikado, however, was not satisfied with the enemy movements. Technical limitations made it difficult to simulate flying. It is said that humans would have been easier to simulate, but the designer considered shooting them immoral. After the release of the 1974 anime Spaceship Battleship Yamato in Japan, and seeing a magazine feature about Star Wars, he thought about using a space theme. Nishikado drew inspiration for the aliens from a novel by H.G. Wells, The War of the Worlds, and created initial bitmap images based on the octopus-like aliens described in the novel. The game was originally titled Space Monsters, after a popular song in Japan at the time, but it was changed to Space Invaders by the designer's superiors. Because the microcomputers in Japan were not powerful enough at the time to perform the complex tasks involved in designing and programming Space Invaders, Nishikado had to design his own custom hardware and development tools for the game. The game uses an Intel 8080 central processing unit. It displays raster graphics on a CRT monitor using a bitmap frame buffer, and uses mono sound hosted by a combination of the analog circuitry and a Texas Instruments sound chip. Space Invaders adopted a multi-chip barrel shifter circuit that was first developed by Midway for another arcade game. This would allow the 8080 CPU to shift pictures in the graphics frame buffer faster than it could using only its own native instructions. Despite the specially developed hardware, Nishikado was unable to program the game he wanted. The control panel board was not powerful enough to display the graphics in color, or move the enemies faster. He He ended up considering the development of the game's hardware as the most difficult part of the whole process. When programming the game, Nishikado discovered that the processor was able to render each frame of the aliens' animation graphics faster when there were fewer aliens on the screen. Since the aliens' positions updated after each frame, this caused the aliens to move across the screen at an increasing speed as more were destroyed. Rather than design it in compensation for the speed increase, he decided to keep it as a challenging gameplay mechanic. Taito released Space Invaders in July of 1978. The cabinet artwork featured large humanoid monsters not present in the game. Nishikado attributes this to the artists basing the designs on the original title of Space Monsters, rather than referring to the actual in-game graphics. In the upright arcade cabinets, the game's graphics are generated on a hidden CRT monitor and reflected upward toward the player using a semi-transparent mirror, behind which is a mounted piece of plastic cutout of the moon bolted against a painted starry background. As the backdrop is visible through the mirror, it makes the background appear behind the graphics. Both Taito and Midway's first Space Invader versions had black and white graphics with a transparent colored overlay using strips of orange and green cellophane over certain portions of the screen to add color to the image. Later Japanese releases used a rainbow-covered overlay, and these were eventually followed by versions with a color monitor and an electrically generated cover overlay. Getting into the actual gameplay, Space Invaders is a fixed shooter, in which the player controls a laser cannon by moving it horizontally across the bottom of the screen and firing at a descending array of aliens. The aim is to defeat all aliens before they reach the bottom of the screen. They will move back and forth horizontally as they advance towards the bottom. The player's laser cannon is partially protected by several stationary defense bunkers that are gradually destroyed from the top and bottom by blasts from either the player or the aliens. The player earns points by shooting and defeating aliens with its laser cannon. As more aliens are defeated, the aliens' movement and the game's music both speed up. Defeating all aliens on the screen brings another wave that is more difficult, a loop which can continue endlessly. A special mystery ship will occasionally move across the top of the screen and award the player with bonus points if it is destroyed. Bases are lost upon being destroyed, and play continues until either the bases are all gone, or the alien reaches the bottom of the screen when the game is over. In the first few months following its release in Japan, Space Invaders became very popular. Specialty arcades even opened offering nothing but Space Invader cabinets, and by the end of 1978, Taito had installed over 100,000 machines and grossed over $600 million in Japan alone. By 1980, Taito had sold over 300,000 Space Invader arcade machines in Japan, and 60,000 machines in the United States within 1 year. By mid-1981, Space Invader machines had grossed more than 4 billion quarters, or $1 billion, and continued to gross an average of $600 million per year, until 1982, by which time it had grossed $2 billion in quarters, which adjusted for inflation in 2021 is the equivalent of $7.84 billion. Net profit from these machines were around $450 million, or again $1.76 billion when adjusted for inflation in 2021. This made it the best-selling video game and highest-grossing entertainment product of its time. Even when compared to the massively successful Star Wars, which released around the same time, Space Invaders made more money.
So the impact of this game can almost not be overstated. It not only kicked off the space craze of arcade video games back in the early 1980s, but it was also responsible for another kickoff in the home market as well. Let's go ahead and take a look at that with the Atari 2600.
In 1980, there was a version developed for the Atari 2600, or Video Computer System as it was known at the time, in order to bring Space Invaders into the home. This was the first official licensing of an arcade game for home consoles, and it became the first killer app for video game consoles after quadrupling the system's sales. It would sell over 2 million units in the first year on sale as a home console game, making it the first title to sell over 1 million cartridges. Now, due to obvious differences in the arcade system versus the Atari VCS, there were many compromises that had to be made to get it to run on such limited hardware. But the sheer fact that they were even able to get something that even looked similar to the arcade version was an incredible accomplishment. And while this game was well received way back in the day, I actually don't find it as fun as the arcade version, and since I have that version to play over the Atari 2600 version, I am more apt to play the arcade version instead. Even still, this is Space Invaders as you would have known it in the arcade. My only nitpicks of this game come from the fact that I think the ship is just a tad bit too wide, as it feels like to me that it is much harder to avoid getting hit by the aliens in this game than it actually is in the arcade. Although don't get me wrong, it is challenging in the arcade version as well. I played this game for about a half hour, and looking through my footage, I could not even get past the first level. But the challenge still doesn't feel unfair. It does feel like that the more you play this game, you'll get better at it and eventually be able to master it.
Space Invaders would go on to be cloned, ported, and copied to almost every single game console and computer system to date. To this day, people are still coding for it and playing it on a variety of systems. And for me, it is one of those few arcade reproduction cabinets that I have in my personal collection. It is one of those iconic titles that people think of when they hear the word arcade or even hear the word video game. It has been referenced in a variety of pop culture media, including The Simpsons.
This scene is from the classic Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 2 episode, in which Willie reveals that he could not fire a pistol because of the arthritis he acquired from Space Invaders in 1977. The joke being that Willie doesn't realize it's a video game.
And even in song, which I can't play here, but for those of you that are curious, I'll leave a link in the description down below.
But for now, that'll wrap up our nostalgia trip back to the arcade, at least until next time. Remember, if you like what you see, please remember to click on that subscribe button below, leave a like and a comment below letting me know what you liked about today's video, and if you'd like to see any of the other arcade games that I have in my collection. Again, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.
Powering off the arcade. Game over.
If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Also, if you enjoy the content of this channel, please remember to click on this subscribe button. Again, I want to thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.